So this video is my first attempt at a series of hot takes that I plan on making. And I guess they're not like super hot takes, but my ADHD brain loves to argue and it loves to debate. And I get really interested and hyper focused on specific topics that I then learn everything I can about and develop really strong opinions that I then harass my friends and family with. And I thought instead of doing that, why don't I film myself talking and then upload it to the internet? And I don't know if that's a better plan than what I was doing before, but I guess we'll find out. So, welcome to my channel. I'm Lucidity, and I'm a PhD student in Japanese history. And I know going forward on this channel, I want to talk about things that I have zero credentials in and probably no business talking about. So, I thought perhaps for our first video, maybe I should talk about things that I do have credentials in. And that's, all things related to Japanese history. It's also more in line with the spirit of the channel. And if there's any Himiko fans out there, we are definitely going to be talking about Himiko today. But we're going to be looking at it from a different perspective. And that's because I want to make a specific argument. And this argument is that you cannot use mythical foundational text as the basis of your academic argument. And more specifically, in the context of Japanese history, you cannot use the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki to make an argument about Japanese history. Okay, so let me clarify a little. It can't be the only thing that you use as the basis of your argument. It has to be something that you can add to other evidence in order to make the argument. And you can do things like speculate on what may or may not have happened and say that the text suggests that this could be the possibility of what had happened. The reason why this is an important distinction to make is because you run the risk when it comes to these kind of texts in perpetuating perhaps nationalist narratives that may or may not justify things like imperialism or maybe denying war crimes that you definitely committed many years ago. Okay, so now I have to take a step back, right? So Japan is a fairly secular country, right? If you were to poll the people of Japan, over 90% of them would say that they're not religious. And this is for the most part true, right? They're not religious in the way that we would imagine in Western countries. They're not like people in the US that go to church every Sunday and, are part of religious communities in that way. They do have cultural religious practices that they follow, of course, Shinto and Buddhism. And there's a saying that when you're born, you go to a Shinto shrine, and when you die, you have a Buddhist funeral. But ideologically, there's sort of a religious tinge to a lot of conservatives in Japan, particularly the older population, that may still be following some of the beliefs that were during the war and during imperialist era of Japan. You see this especially when it comes to politics. The major political party in Japan is the LDP. They've been in power almost continuously since 1955. There's like very short exceptions like from 93 to 96 and from 2009 to 2012. And it's the party today that's sort of over the past I don't know how many years they go back and forth between denying and acknowledging things like Nanking and comfort women's system and attempt to remove references to war crimes from the textbooks. I mean, Abe was notorious for doing this. And it's these conservatives that still really revere the emperor, which is interesting because the emperor is supposed to be a figurehead right now. So let's talk about Shinto as a religion, because there's two ways that we can understand Shinto. And one is the one that everyone knows for the most part, right? It's like Shinto is the indigenous religion of Japan. It's centered around nature. It's polytheistic. There's kami, right? The gods of Japan. And the most important god is Amaterasu. It's also animistic. It means that there's a belief that there's a soul and spirit and everything. Like from the trees to the animals to people, they all share the same sort of spiritual essence. But the second way that you need to understand Shinto is that it is a state religion that was created during the Meiji period. So we're talking the late 1800s, the 19th century, and it's centered around the emperor as a god descended from Amaterasu. When I say it's created, I mean this literally. Like prior to the Meiji period, Buddhism and Shinto were essentially overlapping. You could register your family in a Buddhist temple or a Shinto shrine. There was no real distinction between the two. There are also various points of Japanese history where you could make an argument that Buddhism was more important, at least politically. Not like on an individual level, but definitely there's periods where different temples are fighting for influence over the court during the Nara and Heian periods, right? Where Buddhist temples become sites of rebellion throughout the shogunates that happened for the 1,000 years after that. And when Meiji leaders restored the emperor to power during the Meiji period, they essentially had to disentangle Shinto from Buddhism and define what Shinto was. And this version of Shinto became enmeshed with these new ideas of empire, citizenship, and even the role of the emperor himself. So, if you want to learn more about the end of the Heian period and the start of the Kamakura period, when the emperor lost his position of power and it was replaced by the shogun, I have videos of that on my channel. But the short version of that is that basically, for the 1,000 years prior to the Meiji period, the emperor was a figurehead. And I know the term Meiji restoration implies restoring the emperor to a position of power that he had previously, but this is essentially a marketing strategy, right? Like the role that the emperor has during the Meiji period is unlike one that he ever had even when the emperor was in power during the Heian period. Like the last Heian emperor did not have the same role that the Meiji emperor had in, the 1800s. So again, you can look at my channel if you want to learn more about the fall of the Tokugawa period and into the Meiji period, but you basically have a group of low-ranking samurai that rebel against the Tokugawa Bakufu, oust them from power, oust the shogun from power, and prop up the emperor as a justification for why the shogunate should no longer be the ones ruling Japan. And it's not just these low-ranking samurai. The peasants were pretty pissed for a long time. Like they're suffering from periods of famine and corruption, and they also want to have a new Japan. And when this new Japan is ultimately created by Meiji leaders, it defines a new relationship between all the people of Japan who are now citizens of a state and also underneath the emperor who is now considered the father and they the children, or he's the head and they're the body. And one of the ways you do that is through compulsory education. And this education teaches them what citizen means, what empire means. And part of that education is history. And what does this history say? This history says that the reason we're all following the emperor is because he is a god, descended, unbroken, from the goddess Amaterasu. And we know this because it's in the Kojiki and it's in the Nihon Shoki. So moving up in time to 1945. This is the period of time that I study. Japan surrenders, and the emperor is forced to renounce his godliness. He is no longer a god, he is a human. He's been a human this whole time. It is actually incredibly shocking because up until then, people had never seen him and they had never heard him. Now he's out in public, now he's speaking on radio. And I'm not going to say that everyone in Japan fully believed that he was descended from a god. I'm sure there are some people that were a little bit considering that maybe he wasn't. I do think a lot of people did believe he was actually a god. And I do think a lot of people may still have believed he was a god even after he was forced to say that he wasn't. But I'm going to say something that should be a no-brainer. The emperor is not a god. He is not descended from a god. That is a myth. That is a story. And it's a myth that comes from two books written in the 8th century by a court that's trying to legitimize its power through the consolidation of clan myths. But I'm not as concerned about the everyday average person and what they believe. You can believe whatever you want, to be honest. I'm more concerned about scholars that seem to promote that narrative in their scholarly works. And this is how we get back to Himiko, because scholars of Himiko are notorious for doing this with the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki. For more information about Himiko, again, I have videos on this channel that you could watch, but I'm going to give you the short version. Himiko is essentially a female leader that ruled a federation somewhere in the Japanese peninsula in the year 220 something. And she's a major problem because she's nowhere in the Kojiki or the Nihon Shoki. So the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki are the two foundational texts of Japanese history. The Kojiki is written in 1712. It's also known as the Record of Ancient Matters, and the Nihon Shoki is the Chronicles of Japan, written a little bit after in 720. It's a little bit of a rewrite. There's a couple of things that are changed in between the two of them. They're mostly the same text besides the changes that were made. The Nihon Shoki ends up being the one that's used for many generations after that. And Himiko is nowhere to be found in either of those two texts. And this is a problem for nationalist narratives because she did exist, and we know she existed for several reasons. One, she sent several envoys to China, and China sent its own envoys back to her land of Wa. And they wrote this down in many official records, particularly the records of Wei. There's descriptions of what the land of Wa is like, how the people live their lives, the kind of area surrounding and who lived there. There's a lot of information for this land and for Himiko herself. In my opinion, no, she is not the aunt or sister of a Japanese emperor. Her life does not match a single person in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. She's the leader of a chiefdom. She does rule alongside a brother, but she's part of a federation of chiefdoms, and hers just happens to be the largest. This chiefdom has 80 years of civil war before Himiko is voted into her position of power. She is voted into this position of power. She gets into conflict with a neighboring chiefdom called Kona. And this conflict gets so bad that she has to write to China to ask for help. And by the time the Chinese envoy makes it there, she's already dead. This leads to another dispute amongst the federations of who should lead. And they decide to nominate her niece named Io. And Io becomes the next shamanist leader of Wa. The stories of the different shamanist aunts and sisters and whatnot that are actually in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki don't talk about this at all. Their lives are completely different. And there are information about those women's lives. They do not match Himiko. And Himiko's life do not match theirs. Right? Like you would think 80 years of civil war is something you just don't skip over. But scholars are desperately trying to shoehorn Himiko in where she just does not fit. So again, this is an entire debate that you can learn more about in the videos on my channel. But in my opinion, there is a ton of evidence to suggest that Himiko was in fact in Kyushu and not in the Nara Basin. And it's my belief that attempts to place her in the Nara Basin are just so that they don't contradict the nationalist narratives in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki that support the imperial family. During the late Yayoi period, particularly in the 200s, most archaeological settlements are centered in Kyushu. There's trickles outward, and there are actually archaeological sites in the Nara Basin. It's just pretty clear that the center of Japanese culture, of Wa, is pushed downward into Kyushu. Now, it does move up to the Nara Basin. This does happen, but it happens within like 50 to 100 years after this period. That's when you start seeing that shift to the Nara Basin being the political center. Temporally, Himiko's reign does not align with the dates that are found in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. Because it's more likely that the records that we find in China are more correct than the records in the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. So if you think about it, right, Himiko exists in the year 220 up until about 248, where they believe she died. The Kojiki is written in 712, right? And the way the Kojiki is written is that they go to every major clan in Japan, collect their foundational myths, and then Frankenstein them together into one consolidated myth of Japan. These are also oral histories that were passed down orally. And even those stories are different from how they are consolidated in the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki, because if you go back to those older cities where those clans used to be, they still have their foundational myths. They wrote them down, and they wrote them down from their perspective, and they have completely different details that don't line up with how they were eventually put down in those two texts. Things are taken out, relationships are changed. It's whatever needs to be done to make the story cohesive is done. So whether or not the details were factually correct, clearly was not the main concerns of the people who made the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. Their main concerns were the same concerns that Meiji leaders had in the late 1800s. Power consolidation. So what can we trust as far as the dates go in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki? Does that mean that everything prior to 712 is basically untrustworthy? And the answer is no, not at all. That's not true, but I'll walk you through it. So the beginning of the text is, of course, the creation myth, right? And the creation myth is quite obviously a creation myth. It has all the facets of creation myths all around the world, which there is no problem with that. But this is where we get the story of Amaterasu that supposedly the emperor is descended from. After this, we get to the stories of the early emperors, and we start with the first emperor, Jimmu. And I'm going to be honest, I like Jimmu. I like his story. I think a lot about it is actually really plausible. And this is one of those cases where I think we can maybe infer things that could have or maybe happened. We can't definitively say that the story is true, but if you were to tell me that it was based on a true story, I feel like I could get behind it. His story comes from the Otomo clan, right? It's from the Otomo clan's foundation myth. Jimmu is born in Kyushu, in what is now modern-day Miyazaki Prefecture. He and his brothers move east to find a more suitable location for a capital. They first end up in what is now modern-day Osaka, then called Naniwa. They get into a fight with a local chieftain. Entirely believable, by the way. And then they move on and keep on going until they reach the Nara Basin, where they then fight with the local natives, the Imishi, and oust them, Manifest Destiny style, establishing their new capital there. Also, entirely believable. Now, do I think that this all happened in the year 660 BC? Absolutely not. Not at all. I don't think it matters, but to some people it does. There are all sorts of reasons for why the dates are off in the Nihon Shoki. And part of that is that they use like the Genka calendar system for earlier entries, and they likely exaggerate a lot of the reign lengths to make them seem a lot larger than they were, because those were lucky numbers that were more auspicious at the time. All these early emperors have like 100 years reign or live to like 118, just like wildly implausible reign lengths and lifetime lengths and whatnot. Even the date 660 was probably chose on purpose because it was lucky. And here's another problem. Okay. So after Jimmu, the next like 9 guys likely didn't exist at all. And if they did exist, which I mean, we can make an argument that maybe those guys did exist, we just don't know anything about them, so they had to make up a couple of things about them. The dates are definitely wrong. They definitely would have been in power for a lot less time and probably further into the future than suggested. And the first emperor that we actually have evidence for existing is Emperor Sujin. And this is guy number 10, right? And his story comes from the Mononobe clan. So he has a full backstory. And there's a high likelihood that that means that he does exist, or is based after a person who did exist. The first emperor that we know that the dates are definitely true is Emperor Kinmei, and he's in the year 509 to 571. And it's also highly likely that the dates are right for the guy before him, which is Emperor Yuryaku. And the 5 or so guys before him, we also know for sure did exist because they're found in Chinese records, and they're known now as the 5 kings of Wa because of the correspondence that were between China and Japan during this time. But we also know because of these documents that the dates are wrong prior to Emperor Kinmei and Emperor Yuryaku, because those dates in the Chinese records don't line up with the Kojiki and the Nihon Shoki. Now, some other important information that we get from both Chinese records and Korean records, particularly the Samguk which details the 3 kingdoms of Korea, Goryeo, Bakja, and Silla. Not good at Korean, please forgive me. So these 3 kingdoms are at war, and in 660, Silla enlists help from Tang China to consolidate the area. And one of those kingdoms in particular, Bakja, is allies with Japan. And when they lose in this war, members of the royal family and other supporters of the royal family in Bakja move to Japan and set up a clan there and stay there for the rest of their lives. Coincidentally, Emperor Tenmu, who reigns from 673 to 686-ish, right, commissions the creation of the Kojiki, which will be done in 712. This is within a generation of this conflict. And interestingly enough, the Kojiki does not mention at all this conflict that happened in Korea, nor Japan's role as Pakcha's ally. There's also no mention of any of the tributary relations that we know Japan had with China in all the decades prior to that. And I think this is intentional. Because why is the Kojiki created at this time? One, I think they're trying to distance themselves from this international conflict by establishing themselves as an independent kingdom with its own history, led by a royal family who has divine right to rule. Secondly, it's establishing a sort of alliance with all the other major clans by incorporating their foundational myths into a broader foundational myth. Because Japan, as we know it during this time, it's not nearly as centralized and it doesn't encompass all of the area that it would eventually encompass. And this is the time period where it is unifying. So, who is getting absorbed into this new Japan kingdom, right? So we have clans that are ruling autonomously, that are by alliance submitting to the new emperor. We have the Emishi, also known as Ezo, likely indigenous Jomon peoples that will either move south or north, because we have the Kumasu that likely go down into the Ryukyu and islands and become the Okinawan people, mixing with other people in that area, probably Southern Chinese, right? And then we have Jomon peoples that go up north into Hokkaido that later become the Ainu when they mixed with Ots people and their culture develops there. It's really interesting because Kumaso and the Ainu have like this bear culture, and that's one of those things that can happen. Also, the people in Okinawa and the Ryukyu Islands share DNA closer to the Ainu than either of those share with the rest of Japan. So it's really interesting. So some of those people are subjugated and forced into Japan to become part of that greater project, and some of them are moved up in, or south in different directions. There's also regions that have religious autonomy, particularly you have Isumo, who has the second strongest god at this time. Basically, Amaterasu is the god of the imperial family. This is a history that goes apparently back, they say, to Emperor Sujin, but we know at least during Yuridaku, Issei Jingu, which is associated with Amaterasu, was erected at that time. So the main royal family, Amaterasu, is their main god, right? And this is the main god of Japan. Isumo is actually where we get Susanoo no, and that is the second most important god and is in the foundation myth in the story of Amaterasu. That's her brother. He helps get her out of the cave. It's a whole long, really, really cool story. But you can imagine that when they're creating the Kojiki and they're deciding, how this story is going to come about, including Isumo as the second most important god in that foundation myth shows you their place within Japanese society as a whole. And you can imagine there's probably like some marriage alliances happening, things like that, in order to get people to become part of this larger project and to recognize the imperial family as the most important family. And all of these smaller clans, their gods are in the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki as well. And it's like all these major, the most important clans that are in Japan in this period, their gods are in that story. Like the guy who plays the music and the guy who dances and all of this stuff. Like these gods are the gods of those major clans. And it sets up like how they relate to the emperor and justifies their position of authority in that time period. Okay. So why am I bringing this up at all, right? And like I said earlier, it's because scholars themselves are using the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki to make certain arguments about who Himiko was and how she fits into the broader history of Japan. So I have an example, but I'm going to preface this with the fact that I actually really, really love this book. It's J. Edward Kidder. It's Himiko and Japan's Elusive Chiefdom of Yamatai, Archaeology, History, and Mythology. And actually think this book is incredible. You're not going to find a better description of the Yayoi period, how people lived, what they ate, how they dressed, like a complete deep dive into the records of Wei, analysis of the different possible routes that they took from China to get to her kingdom, and a way to try to figure out if she's in the Nara Basin or if she's in Kyushu, of course, and then a very great like analysis of the mirrors and where we find them and at what time and what that says about the Kofun and what that says about where the major royal family must have lived during that period. But it's his final chapter that really gets to me a bit because it's where he sort of goes into the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki and kind of takes it a little bit at face value when trying to make a guess of who he thinks Himiko was. And he does exactly the thing that I don't think we should be doing. So from scholar to scholar, I don't want to rag on this man's book. I do want to make a scholarly critique of your work, though. So on page 281, he says, somewhere buried in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki accounts is the tribal confederation leader the Chinese called Himiko. He then suggests that she's either one of the shamanists that's mentioned in the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki that was just subordinated to a less powerful position, or, and I kind of think this is far worse of a take, but he thinks that she could have maybe even been Emperor Sujin himself, swapped from female to male in order to make the male line of succession seem unbreakable. And I just don't think that this is possible. Like, even Kidder knows, like, he mentions that prior to the 5th century, the Nihon Shoki contains only, like, grains of truth, right? But he still argues that perhaps Himiko is Emperor Sujin, but just as a girl, and I just kind of think that okay, here's the thing. I really do appreciate that he does acknowledge that there's a time discrepancy. He moves Emperor Sujin from his regular dates, which is 97 BC to 30 BC, right? And he says that it's more likely that Emperor Sujin is in the 3rd century. But according to his own adjustment of the dates, he thinks Emperor Sujin ruled in like 265, which is way after Himiko is already dead. Which, I mean, plausible, right? Because this is the first one that we know for sure is real, right? So we could have had a Jimmu figure and then Emperor Sujin, and that could have happened after Himiko. Possible. But I kind of don't think that Emperor Sujin is Himiko. And then he points to Emperor Sujin's granddaughter and his aunt, who are both shamanists, and he thinks that it's likely that she could be one of them as well. But again, I don't think the stories match up. And Kidder isn't the worst offender by any stretch of the imagination. And he's mostly an archaeologist, so like, you know, history's not his thing. I can forgive that. But the Japanese historians are the worst when it comes to Himiko and, assigning who she was. Because most people just say that she's Jingu and move on with it. Because Jingu is a female leader that is assigned to the dates 201 to 269 AD. But we already know the dates are off, so it's impossible that she could be Jingu. Also, the story does not line up at all. And there is a reason why there is a woman assigned to these dates. And that's because the writers of the Nihon Shoki and the Kojiki knew that Himiko existed. They knew those records existed. They had everything at their disposal to write her down into those books and made the conscious decision not to and put Jingu there because she's a woman and thought, if anybody sees this, they'll go, oh, that had to be Jingu. But the stories don't line up because Jingu is actually a very fascinating character and her story is really interesting and I think even plausible. Like, she actually goes to Korea and is involved in war and things like that that probably happened a little bit further in, maybe the 300s, even the 400s, right? So it's possible, but I think putting her there was intentional so that we don't ask any questions about Himiko. We just assume that she's Jingu and move on with it. But I think like we have enough evidence to say that she definitely wasn't. And there's a lot of scholars that just say that's her, that's it, and move on because they'd rather not question the text any further than we've already have. And anyway, here's my final say. And this is what I think is possible. I think that during the late Yayoi period in, the 200s when Himiko is sending envoys to China, I think it wasn't consolidated into one unified polity. I know the Japanese imperial family wants to say that Japan was one unified state all the way to time eternal. I just don't think that it's plausible in this time period during the late Yayoi period. I think likely Himiko is one leader of several chiefdoms and just the most powerful during this time in that area, at least. I think the imperial family today is possibly another powerful chiefdom that started in Miyazaki, moved up, and then landed in the Nara Basin at some point. I think likely Himiko's chiefdom lost power. Himiko herself dies, and they vote in a 13-year-old girl after that we never hear about again. Never hear about again. I don't think she lasted that long because she wasn't sending envoys to anywhere. So who's to say that the Kona or another chiefdom didn't come in and take power from Io? I think the imperial family that we have today probably didn't consolidate power until a little bit after this time period. I think it's likely that Himiko is probably even unrelated to the imperial family. I think when this war happens in Korea and Pakcha loses, it strengthens the imperial family. And they're able to use that power to consolidate Japan, and that stays stable for thousands of years after. And I think that's also an impressive story. And I think we can give the imperial family credit. So anyway, I want to end this video with one last thing, and that is I made this video 3 times. 3 whole times. The first time, I didn't like how it came out, so I filmed it a second time. That second time, my video editing software, like, ate that video. It went into the void, it was gone, I have no idea what happened to it. Never to be seen again. So, I had to film it this third time, which was a lot, but if there's one good thing that came out of it, is that I went to Loft this week, and look what I found! It's a plushie of a kofun! I never thought I would see something like this in my life. Look how cute it is. There's a little haniwa, like, popping out of it in the side. There's, like, all cute and stuff. Isn't that adorable? Anyway, I think this is really cute. Also, there was a Steam sale, and I know there's a lot of people that like to write on the Himiko videos that they've been to Yamatai themselves because they played Tomb Raider, and for $2 I bought Tomb Raider so that I can play it as well. And I think at some point I'll play it and I might film it for you and make a video. So I think that would be really fun. I remember the original Tomb Raiders when I was in like elementary school, and my dad would play, and I haven't played any of the newer ones, so I guess it's like the game from the 2010s, 2013 or something like that. But I'm gonna play, and I think it'll be fun. So anyway, if you have anything you want to say about this video, I'm happy to talk about it with you in the comments section. If you have, more facts, more evidence, more things you want to argue, I think it would be fun. I definitely, just even though I study this, that doesn't mean that I know absolutely everything. I don't think anybody knows absolutely everything. So I'm more than happy to have a fact-based intellectual conversation with you in the comments section. And if you got this far, thank you for watching. Thank you for continuing to support the channel. And I will be back with more to say about random things. So, bye.